Good morning, church. I would like to talk about our two greatest fears this morning: death and public speaking. Taxes might be the third greatest, yes. Our two greatest fears are death and public speaking. I think we can wrap our minds around why death is such a fear. I think for the believer, even being grounded in the Word, knowing what is next, there is still this fear of the unknown, this sense of I'm not quite sure what to expect. I can read the Bible, I can pick up on all of what heaven is, I can pick up on what the new creation is going to be like. I can look forward to this glorified body that I will receive, but man, there's something that just still kind of looms over that transition from this life into eternity. And then there is public speaking, and I think for some of us, it may seem a little bit silly that public speaking and death are on the top two list for our greatest fears, but for most people, the number one fear is public speaking. Number two is death. You know what that means? People would rather die than speak in front of people. You would rather be in the coffin than doing the funeral, is what that means. So, as someone who speaks publicly for a living, I think that there is a reason why public speaking is so scary. There is something about public speaking that we have to put ourselves out there. We have to make ourselves vulnerable, and in making ourselves vulnerable, we kind of expose ourselves. We can be seen as not funny enough, as not being able to communicate enough, as not serious enough, as not being able to get the point across. We put ourselves out there, and in any time we make ourselves vulnerable, we are exposed like that, we can kind of get chopped for it. And when we get chopped for it, it leads to humiliation. And humiliation then leads to mockery. We'll kind of dive into this idea a little bit more as we go on, especially in my life as I have journeyed down this weird path of public speaking and how the Lord has moved there. Let me just reassure you right now, today's sermon is not about public speaking. But public speaking can bring about things that Jesus will go through today. Today, Jesus is in the weight and the balance of our two greatest fears, and that is he is very near to his death. And he is also very near to something and experiences something today that comes about when we speak publicly, and that is humiliation and mockery. So today our main point, the point that we want to prove and really drive home, is that Jesus is our King, and he is our substitution. Jesus is our King and our substitution. The first thing that we see today is our King's response. The King's response as we continue in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, Family. It's only been 1,000 sermons, but we're finally here. Chapter 15, there's only one to go, and the next one's only 8 verses. It's going to be great. We only have 2 more sermons in the Gospel of Mark, and we have completed this. And as a completionist, that brings me great joy. Great joy. So we dive in. Verses 1 through 5, and as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priest accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. What's happening here in verses 1 through 5? The first thing that we see happen right here in verse 1 is there is a morning consultation. If you will recall last week, Jesus' trial took place at night. In Jesus' trial taking place at night, it was not supposed to happen like that. That was breaking the rules. And so they held a consultation in the morning where all 70 members of the Sanhedrin plus the high priest, so 71 all together, woke up early, reconvened, and tried to make this thing seem legit. We have to remember that they are wanting to expedite Jesus' execution. They are wanting to have him killed before Sabbath begins on Friday evening, so they had to move quickly. 71 people come together to make this thing happen, to condemn the man who was absolutely innocent, to make him look guilty. And so they finalize their guilty sentencing of Jesus. They bind him, and then also in verse 1, they deliver Jesus to Pilate. Now, Pilate's a pretty new character in the story for us, and so who is Pilate? He was the Roman procurator. Think of him just as a governor over the region of Judea that has been appointed by Rome. Pilate ruled. He ruled from the years AD 26 to AD 36. Now, some of you may say, is this the History Channel? I don't care about years. I don't care about any historical facts, but this is important to us. We see that Jesus' ministry took place in AD 30 through AD 33, and knowing when Pilate ruled kind of helps us narrow that down. So for all my apologists in the room, that is not saying you're sorry about the faith. It is making a defense of the faith. This is something that's important to know. Something that's also important to know is that Pilate was cruel and harsh. He despised the Jews, and being someone who despised the Jews, he enjoyed antagonizing the Jews. He was the type of guy that would compromise by looking the other way if it meant keeping the peace. And so now knowing who Pilate is, we have to ask the question, well, why would Jesus need to be taken to Pilate? Well, Jesus would need to be taken to Pilate because the Jewish religious leadership had no authority to take life. And so what they have to do is paint Jesus in a guilty light before Pilate so that Rome will take the life of Jesus for them. They want Rome, they want Pilate to be the ones that get their hands dirty so that they can stay clean. Also, they have no authority in this area. The task at hand is convince Pilate to kill Jesus. Verse 2, we see that Jesus is questioned by Pilate. Now, something else we need to know about this guy, Pilate, is he is very insecure. He is deeply evil, but he is also on his last straw with Caesar. Now, he wants to know if this king-claiming man in Jesus is actually going to be a threat because Caesar would not like that. And so Pilate must deal with Jesus well. He also doesn't want to tick off the Jewish religious leadership because the Jewish religious leadership have kind of become a thorn in the backside of Pilate. Because anytime he does anything that they don't approve of, they go and tattletale to Caesar. They're like little brothers and sisters. If you grew up with them, you know. If you know, you know. They had done so in the past. This is why Pilate's on his last straw now. And so Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Seemingly the most important thing that he wants to take care of. Jesus answered, "You have said so." Now Jesus makes this Pilate's claim. Jesus with Pilate, much like with the high priest last week, essentially puts the words in his mouth. Pilate makes an ignorant confession of Jesus as the king, as the Messiah. And this is a cryptic response from Jesus. This is essentially Jesus saying, yes, I am the king, but I think he's saying, I am not the king that you are expecting. I'm not like any king that you could possibly think of. This is very similar to what he would say in John 18:36, where he says, my kingdom is not of this world. Then in verse 3, it says, and the chief priests accused him of many things. Now we see in the same situation, same scenario, separate gospel account in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 2, that they actually accused Jesus here of three things. It's a little bit more detailed. Luke would have been a little bit more detailed than Mark here, as Peter's telling him what to write. The first thing that they say is, we found this man subverting our nation. Number two, he was opposing payment of taxes to Caesar. Now, we know that this isn't true because Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's. We remember that because we got a whole sermon on finances out of it, and we all loved it so much. Do you remember that? The third thing that they accuse Jesus of is saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. Now again, we have to recall the position that Pilate is in here because of the Jewish religious leadership, that he is on his last straw with Caesar. And that someone claiming to be a king of anyone or anything may prove to be trouble for him, because that would directly challenge Caesar's rule. In the eyes of Rome, what we need to know is this is the cause of capital punishment, because this is a capital crime. And so what does Pilate do? He does the same thing when you're having a conversation with someone and they say something that's important, but they surround it by a bunch of stuff you don't care about. You don't address any of those things. You just address the thing that you actually care about. He skips the first through two things that they bring to him, and he goes straight to what he is interested in. So, Jesus, what kind of king are you? Verses 4 through 5, we see that this time, Jesus is silent. Pilate can't make sense of his silence. And so according to the Gospel of Luke, what Pilate does is he now sends him on to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is a former enemy of Pilate. We won't go too deep into this, but Pilate did some things that kind of ticked Herod off, got Herod into a lot of trouble, and so now Pilate knows that Herod is interested in the person of Jesus. There's two reasons that he's interested in the person of Jesus. The first one is because if you remember, way back early on in the Gospel of Mark, Herod was the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin. Herod had Jesus' cousin's head cut off. So, Jesus' ministry is starting to kick off. He's becoming interested in the person of Jesus, and he starts to think maybe this Jesus is actually John the Baptist resurrected. John the Baptist in a new form. Maybe some time goes on, and he starts to hear about the miracles of Jesus, and he starts to think, maybe I just want to get in front of this guy so I can see some of his miracles. Jesus goes before Herod Antipas. He's absolutely silent. He does not throw his pearls before the swine of the man that killed his cousin. He remains silent, and in doing so again this week, just as we saw last week before the high priest, prophecy is fulfilled. Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. I think for both Pilate and Herod, they saw that there was absolutely no fuss about this man. They could not figure out what the fuss was all about from these Jewish religious leaders. Neither of these evil men, neither of these evil rulers could find anything that was threatening, let alone guilty, about our King Jesus. So what's the point here? The point here is that Jesus stands before his shearers, silent. Jesus stands silent before his shearers. Why this is important is because this is just a symbol of what is to come. And what is to come and what we are really going to focus in on today is that Jesus is in our place for our sins. That Jesus here is guiltless before Pilate, but being innocent. He doesn't try to fight to prove his innocence like you and I would. We'd be trying to justify every reason we've done this and we've done that, but Jesus, being absolutely innocent, stands silent as if he is guilty, representing our sinfulness. Absolutely quiet. What does this mean for you? What does this mean for me? This means for us that we have sin that needed to be dealt with. That we still have sin that needs to be dealt with. That we have nothing to say for the sin that we commit. But you and I, we stand guilty. What this means is that he was a substitution that atoned for our sin. That our sin divided us, separated us from God and his love and the ability to have a relationship with him at all. But Jesus, in his sacrifice, being the perfect sacrifice that never sinned on the cross in our place for our sin, now atones for our sin. It brings us at one with God. Our sin is justified. It is just as if we had never sinned at all. And now, therefore, there is no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. This is what it means for us. We have a substitute. Beautiful. And while this doesn't take full effect until the cross, this is a great foreshadowing. And we see this continue on into verses 6 through 15. And it's in these verses that it all starts to come together. It's in these verses that we see the king's substitution. The king's substitution. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner from whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd and had him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call king of the Jews?" And they cried out, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Second place here, in verses 6 through 8, is the release of a prisoner. In verse 6, we see something that is customary in this time, something that took place and able to enable them to gain favor and to keep peace with the Jews, to keep peace with this crowd, something that Rome would sometimes do if mercy needed to be showed and if the crowd demanded it. Think back to one of the all-time greatest movies of all time. It goes Braveheart, The Gladiator, Too Fast, Too Furious. Okay? Braveheart, The Gladiator, Too Fast, Too Furious. If you will remember back with me the exact historical canon of a movie, The Gladiator, you will remember the great Emperor Joaquin Phoenix. You remember him? Joaquin Phoenix as his role as Commodus in The Gladiator, as he stands ruling over the gladiatorial arena and he holds his thumb up and he does it down, up, down, all depending on the crowd. That is essentially what is taking place here. Something that was customary in order to keep the peace. Let's show some mercy here. Verse 7, we see Barabbas. He's a new character to us. What we know of Barabbas is that he was a notorious rebel, that he was a freedom fighter, and he was a murderer. His name, while not uncommon, I nerd out about this stuff, so maybe you will too. Otherwise, I'll just look like a geek up here, and that's totally fine. But Barabbas in this time, if you did a Google search back then, you would have found that it is the 21st most common name. So as we hear Barabbas, we're like, okay, cool, weird name. Not sure what that's all about, but as we hear Barabbas, we should think, okay, as they would have heard it, this is not uncommon whatsoever. What Barabbas means is son of the Father. Bar meaning of, Abbas meaning the Father. Think about who he is being compared to now. The true son of God the Father. Now, Barabbas had a particular target that he liked to cause trouble for. He often went after the wealthy, the high class, the nobility of Israel and Rome. And so this is a man that Pilate would gladly put to death because he was truly guilty and because he was actually a threat to the peace. And then we see in verse 8, we see the crowd. And the crowd says, "Release a prisoner to us like you have done before." Now, what we need to know is this whole thing kicks off early in the morning, starting at 6 a.m. These people, they did not normally just wake up and go to Pilate's place of work and just hang out because they were great buddies with him. These people have been placed. These people have been staged by someone higher up, by someone pulling the strings. Now, I spent some time on YouTube this week trying to find some great illustrations for this part. And what I found is there's actually been some protests, some rallies back in the promised land of Texas. Maybe you've heard of it. It's the land of milk and honey. We miss it greatly, but we know that this is where God has called us, and Arizona is actually now better in our minds and in our hearts. There's been some protests. In these protests, they thought, man, this is really weird that these people are so passionate about these things that they're protesting, but then it comes 12 p.m. and these people are on the buses with their signs, they're going back to their vehicles, and they are taking off. So weird that one of the journalists around actually asked one of these people, hey, what is it? What's the cause that you are protesting for? And one of these people had no idea. And so they go to someone else, and this person, I guess, was a little bit more important. Maybe they were in charge. They pulled out a piece of paper from their back pocket and had to read what they were protesting about. I mean, what great passion that person had. They had no idea why they were actually there. Now, what happened was the journalist got with some police, and the police actually set up a geofence around this area. I'm not going to go into the technicalities and details of that, but basically if you walk into a geofence, it interacts with your phone, it pulls data from your phone, and what they found was, yes, you have walked into more geofences than you could ever know, okay? There's a spiritual realm and there's a technological realm. It's just as evil, okay? Watch out for geofences. It pulled information from their phones, and then they realized, oh, all these people have actually been at this rally and this protest, this rally and this protest, this rally and this protest, and they start to put the dots together, and they realize, oh, these people are being staged. This isn't actually a passionate cause. This is someone with a lot of money that wants to oppose somebody that's doing something they don't want them to do. That is exactly what is happening here. This crowd is placed there. There is a master puppeteer, and their strings are being pulled as puppets. 9 through 12, we see the motivation of the Jewish leaders. Who do you want me to release? The King of the Jews is the question that Pilate asked. Now, for Pilate, this is his way out. He has already told the Jewish religious leaders, I find no grounds for charging him being Jesus. We see that in John 18:38. Now, Pilate, if he was a smart man, which here I think he actually was being, he listened to his wife, because in Matthew 27:19, Pilate's wife warns him, have nothing to do with this righteous man, for today I have suffered terribly in a dream because of him. Pilate knew their motivation. And their motivation is they only wanted Jesus gone out of envy because he was a threat to their power and their authority. He could flip everything upside down on them and they would be ruled and they would be dismissed from the places of leadership that they ruled from. But there was nothing that Jesus was guilty of. Pilate knew this. And so he gave the crowd an option. Now, this would allow him to release an innocent man and at the same time allow him to stick it to the Sanhedrin. And so, of course, Pilate was all about it. But things did not go as hoped. Certainly not for Pilate. Things seemingly have gone the ways that these evil people have hoped for. And I don't want to paint this picture that the Jewish religious leaders were evil and that Pilate was a good guy. The Jewish religious leaders were evil. Pilate was evil. Pilate was not looking out for Jesus. Pilate was looking out for Pilate. Everything he's doing here is out of selfishness and trying to save his hide. And so, things don't go according to the way that some of us might have hoped, certainly not as Pilate had hoped, but things went perfectly, swimmingly, according to the ways that God planned it. Because again, something we need to realize is that God takes account and he uses the evil intentions of man, but he can weave them together for his plan, for his glory, and for our good. That's Romans 8:28. What happens next? The chief priest incites the crowd. They begin to shout, Barabbas' name, give us the guilty. And then verses 13 through 15, we begin to see the unjust punishment of Jesus. Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? As we mentioned last week, the punishment for the supposed blasphemy of Jesus was supposed to be stoning. What is it that this crowd shouts here? Crucify him. Now, the crucifixion was an invention by Rome to encourage people to be good citizens. They would often crucify people and they would leave them up. The crucifixion that Jesus went through on the cross was a much more expensive crucifixion because it was 2 pieces of wood. Normally, they would just impale people on a spike and they would drown from choking on their own blood. I think a lot of times we can see the crowd on Palm Sunday, which today is, by the way, singing, Hosanna, Hosanna, save now, save now. And then we can look at this crowd that says, crucify him, and we can think it's the same crowd. But I think it's like Twitter. There's one crowd over here, and very seldom does this crowd go over to this crowd. We'll just call this the red crowd, okay? And then there's a crowd over here, and it's a blue crowd. And very seldom does this blue crowd go over to the red crowd. And so there's an echo chamber over here, there's an echo chamber over here, but there's not actually a lot of overlap if you really look at this situation. I think maybe that's what's happening here. Now, I'm not positive, but speculation. What shall we do with the man you called the King of the Jews? They want death, and they want death by the worst imaginable torture possible, crucifixion. And then it says, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. I think for us, we often focus on the physical pain that Jesus went up to, leading to the cross and the cross itself. And we think of that in a physical sense only, and we think, man, Jesus really suffered for me physically, but I think a lot of times we detach the fact that Jesus suffered far more spiritually than he did physically. That there were 3 hours on the cross where Jesus is no longer in perfect relationship with God the Father. And the sin of man for all of time, anything you've ever sinned, anything you will ever sin, for every single person that has ever lived was poured out in God's wrath, the consequences of that on our King Jesus. The spiritual implication was far more than the physical. With that being said, let's paint a picture for what the physical torture and punishment of Jesus actually looked like here. William Lane paints this picture. It says a Roman scourging was a terrifying punishment. The delinquent was stripped, bound, and was beaten by a number of guards until his flesh hung in bleeding shreds. The instrument indicated by the Markan text, the dreaded flagellum, was a scourge consisting of leather strips plated with several pieces of bone or lead so as to form a chain. Men condemned to flagellation frequently collapsed and died from the flogging. This is just some of what Jesus went through physically. Now imagine, spiritually, far, far worse. What's the point of all of this? The point of all of this is beautiful. The point of all of this is unfair. And the point of all of this impacts you and me, unlike most sermons that I could ever preach. The point of all of this is substitution. The point of this is that Jesus was innocent, but he was declared guilty. Barabbas was guilty, but he was treated as innocent and he was received as a hero. Jesus took Barabbas' punishment. Jesus died in Barabbas' place. What does this mean for you? What does this mean for me? This means that Jesus is our substitution. That the true Son of the Father, sinless and innocent, was beaten and crucified. That the Father turned his back on him for bearing our sin. And the other Son of the Father, Barabbas, sinful and guilty, will be set free because Jesus became his substitute. Church, what does this mean for us? This means that we are Barabbas. We are the ones that have been swapped out for Jesus. We are the guilty, substituted for the innocent. For us, this means we have some reflecting to do. For us, this means we need to take into account the sin in our life, the reason that there had to be a swap out in the first place, the ways that we've fallen short of God's mark of perfection, the ways that we have sinned against God and against other people, causing harm to other people and to ourselves, the way that we have caused harm in our relationship to God the Father. We need to take this into account. Why is it that Jesus needed to be substituted in my place for my sin? Well, it was for my sin. And then we need to praise. We need to praise the one that took our place. Because for you and me, as Barabbas, this should have been the punishment that you and I received. But instead, it's our King Jesus. Let's let that soak in. Let's take it all in. And let's respond. Let's realize that not only did Jesus endure great punishment, but now we see that he also underwent great humiliation. Final point this morning is that we are diving into the king's mocking. Verses 16 through 20. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him with a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him, and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of his purple cloak and put his own clothes back on him, and they led him out to crucify him. What we see here in these 4 verses is that the mockery continues. Now the whole battalion is called together. A battalion back then consisted of 600 hardened Roman soldiers. And we see a few things happen here. All symbolism and mockery. We see that they clothed Jesus with a purple cloak, that this was to mock his royalty. Again, not any king like they had ever seen. That they twist together thorns into a crown and they press it on his head. Another mockery of his royalty. But biblically, again, not mockery, biblically, this was to represent God's curse on sinful humanity now being put onto Jesus. We see this in Genesis 3, 17 through 18. They shout mockery at him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," because this is the way that they were to hail their very own Caesar. They are now sarcastically hailing Jesus. They hit him with a stick. This is a mockery of the king's scepter. They continue to spit on him and to insult him, and then they kneel down and mock worship. when they had their fill of his torment and torture, they led him out to be crucified. I think for us, we need to realize that as horrible as this is, all of these things that these men are doing to our King, that Jesus suffered at the hands of those whom he came to save. Jesus suffered and would die for these very men that were torturing him. That he was completely alone, having been abandoned and betrayed, humiliated, stripped naked, and beaten almost to death. Physical pain is one thing, but this is utter public humiliation and shaming, and that's another thing. We need to realize that our Savior endured all this ridicule, shame, and pain, once again leading to his death on the cross, where he would earn our salvation. I think for us, just to ever so slightly perceive what Jesus is going through here, we just need to think back to our most embarrassing moment of our lives and multiply it times 1,000. I think for me, one of the most embarrassing situations as we talk about death in public speaking was a moment of public speaking for me early on in my life in ministry that led to me thinking, man, it would just be better if I was dead than if I had to ever speak in front of people again. There was a Sunday back in Irving, Texas. I'm just a few years into ministry at this point. It is my job to welcome people into church, just as Jeremy did for us this morning. Hey, welcome to the church we were going to. Point them to the Connect card. Hey, we live life in community. We want to live life together. It's the same thing I had done time after time after time again. It was just a normal, ordinary Sunday. So I thought. Pastor was out of town. Thank goodness for how this story plays out. Associate pastor was in charge. The difference in this Sunday is the Saturday before I was the student pastor and I had been working in the student building. I had been doing some wiring up in the crawl space above our youth area. It's tile ceiling just like this. So I was standing on a ladder, and as I was working up in the ceiling / attic, whatever that is, the ladder got a little wobbly. I fell off the ladder. As I fell off the ladder, I hit my head on some scaffolding or some steel beams on the way down. I can't recall exactly what it was until I went and saw the blood on it. Just kidding, there wasn't much blood. Hit my head on that. Apparently rattles me more than I realized, but I landed like Spider-Man, like off of this ladder. It was absolutely incredible. Superhero landing. Stuck the landing. So proud of myself for sticking that landing that it doesn't even faze me that I just hit my head so hard that there's probably something wrong with me now. I then go home. I get ready for church like it's just a normal Sunday. I then go and do the welcome and announcements, and halfway through the welcome, something happens to me that I had not experienced before. My face goes flush. I mean, it's white. I start sweating. These lights that are shining on me are the lights that have always been there. They seem brighter and hotter than ever before. My vision starts to narrow. It starts to get a little blurry. I start to not make sense. The sentence that I am saying to our congregation is just on repeat over and over and over and over, like any good boy band song back in the 90s on your Sony Walkman, okay? It's not making any sense. Someone in the congregation says, someone needs to check on him. Oh, Rhonda. In that moment, I realize there's something wrong. I excuse myself. I stumble down the stairs. I get to the pew. Yes, we had pews that our associate pastor was sitting in. And I say, hey, Ron, something's wrong. I need you to go do announcements. And he says, sit down. Just sit down. You sit down, and Ron says, sit down. He went up. He finished the announcements. I go into the hallway. One of our youth leaders and a seasoned veteran firefighter has checked me out. And they say, hey, man, you need to go to the emergency room. There's something wrong. Me and Rachel then go to the emergency room. I get checked out. Turns out I just have a massive concussion. Thank goodness I didn't have any bleeding on my brain or anything like that. And so it's a concussion. I played football. I've had hundreds of these things. So good. What I didn't realize is that moment in time would create something in my brain, a new neural pathway that would then lead me to greatly fear and have great anxiety anytime I needed to speak up in front of people again. Now, as your pastor, I want to be completely transparent. I want to be see-through. I want to be genuine and authentic up here. I want you to know that public speaking is still a great fear for me. Because anytime I have to go and speak before people, what my brain does is it goes back to that moment and it goes through the same process and the same pattern of shutdown. And I think, oh my goodness, my brain is failing me once again, and so fight or flight kicks in and I have to either fight or fly. Now, the Lord has greatly restored me, almost fully in that, but there's still a great fear. As we talk about humiliation, as we talk about being exposed, as we talk about being embarrassed, I go back to that moment because in that moment, in public speaking, I was completely exposed. I was putting myself completely out there. And in that moment, I experienced something I had not experienced before, and that was failure in my own strength, failure of my flesh, failure in this body that I was trusting and had always been able to trust in. In that moment of exposure came humiliation. My body failed me. I couldn't complete a sentence. I said the same thing over and over. This is completely embarrassing. Now, thank goodness it happened at church because mockery didn't really come around much. The only people that mocked me from that point forward were the people that should mock me, and that was my best friends, as only your best friends can do. So we take this into account. Moments of exposure that lead to humiliation, that then lead to mockery. We then put ourselves back in Jesus' shoes here, and Jesus is completely humiliated. Jesus is completely mocked. What we see is that he suffers the injustice and insults that we should have suffered, that he has experienced the shame and the pain that we should have been experiencing. And we have to remember here that he was stripped naked, that he was spit upon, that he was beaten, that he was whipped, and this is the King of heaven. And that he bore the guilt and the curse that we should have borne. What we see here in Jesus' humility and mockery is that the shepherd was struck that the sheep, you and me, might be saved. That the king was tortured and killed so that his people might live. I think what you and me need to see here is that in Jesus' suffering, there is actually something that is so beautiful and so needed and necessary in our lives. And that is that in Jesus' suffering, there is an invitation for salvation. That the substitution of Jesus in our place for our sin can only happen in our lives if we put our trust in his work on the cross to save us from our sin and from the consequence of our sin. That the continued salvation of sanctification, of being enslaved to sin and being set free from that can only happen when we put our trust in Jesus to be our Lord. When we realize that he emptied himself out. And so we need to empty ourselves out. We need to quite literally make room for him. For those of you that are saved, we continue to be saved when we become more like Jesus until one day we are saved perfectly in our state of glorification when we stand before God the Father, being covered by the blood of the Son. And until then, what we need to realize as part of this invitation is realizing it's not about our will. It's about his. Die to yourself. Die to your expectation. Die to your ways, because we are saying it's not about me now, King. It is about you. It's not about our power. It's not about our might. It's not about our ability to make things happen, but it's about the power of the Holy Spirit to do it in failed vessels that were never supposed to be able to do it in the first place. It's not about our fear. It's not about the shame that says you can't go do this. It's now about the empowering of the Spirit that says, no, you can't on your own, but I've got you and you will. So go be obedient and see how I move. It's not about our lives being glorified in us. It's about his life in us and how that plays out to the world around us. The people that are lost, that are broken, that need hope, that need true life, and that the only way that that good news is ever going to get to them is if you actually go and live that out. So how is it that we respond to this invitation? Have you taken Jesus up on his invitation to salvation? Or was that just a one-time thing? Is that just a get-out-of-hell-free card? Or do you continue to die to yourself every day, laying yourself down before his throne, saying, not my will, but yours. Not what I want, but what you want. King, let me check in with you. Is this what you have in store for me? Is this what you have put into place? Or am I just going to go about my day falsely worshiping myself? Have we taken him up on his offer for salvation? Or have we ignored it? And we're marching into our destruction. We're marching into hell ignorantly. And the painful agony of the consequence of our sin is now upon us because we have seen the substitute and we said, no, I will not put my faith in you. I will stand there myself and I will not be able to bear the wrath of God. And the consequence of sin is death. Death apart from the Father. So church, what do we do with this? How is it that we are to be the church and display the kingdom with all of this being said? Quite simply. Not really quite simply, but quite simply, rely on the King. Rely on the King to deal with your sin, to be your substitute in your place for your sin, to quite literally suffer in your place what you should have suffered, and to earn your salvation. Because we got a lot of good people in here, and y'all's lives are really put together. But they're not put together enough to earn heaven. They're not put together enough to work your way out of sin. There's only one way that happens. And that's trusting in the work of Jesus on the cross. It's a perfect sacrifice in our place for our sin. And saying, it is you that have saved me. I put my trust and my faith in you and in you alone. So save me. Let's pray.